The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in like a second skin, suffocating and heavy. But beneath it, I could still hear the remnants of his voice, sharp, cutting, meant to wound. "You make everything so damn difficult, Charlotte." I had stood in the kitchen, my back to him, my fingers curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles white with restraint. I had told myself not to react, not to flinch, not to let him see just how deep his words cut. But he had known. He always knew. Maybe if you didn't second-guess every little thing, you wouldn't be such a burden. The laugh that had escaped me was bitter, involuntary. I turned to face him then, the overhead light casting shadows across his face, making him look harder, colder. Nathan. My husband. The man I had loved once, maybe still did, though I wasn't sure anymore. He had been the kind of man who could charm a room without trying, who carried himself with an effortless confidence that had once drawn me in like a moth to a flame. But years of loving him had taught me that his affection was conditional, his patience finite. "That's what you think of me?" I had asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. Nathan scoffed, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "That's what everyone thinks, Charlotte. I'm just the only one honest enough to say it to your face." I had felt the words like a slap. I should have fought back. I should have screamed, thrown something, demanded to be seen, to be valued. But I had done that before, and I knew how it would end. Exhaustion. Apologies that meant nothing. Another night spent lying beside him in a bed that felt colder than it should. So instead, I had stood there in silence as he grabbed his coat and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the walls. I had stayed frozen in place long after he was gone, staring at the space he had occupied, waiting for the anger to come. But it didn't. Only a quiet, sinking exhaustion settled in its place. I turned now, my gaze flicking to the door as it opened again. For a moment, just a flicker of a second, my stomach twisted at the thought that it might be Nathan, coming back with half-hearted remorse and empty words. But it wasn't him. Noah. The relief hit me so hard my legs nearly buckled. He didn't speak as he stepped inside, but he didn't need to. His eyes swept over me, over the half-packed suitcase in the corner, the mug of untouched tea in my hands, and then back to my face. His expression softened in that way it always did when he saw me like this, like he wished he could shoulder the weight of it all himself. Without hesitation, he closed the space between us, reaching out to rest a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, grounding. He had seen me like this before, too many times. He had been the one to pick me up off the floor after the last fight, the one who had always known before I did that I wasn't okay. And now, without a word, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. It was quick, barely more than a whisper of warmth against my skin, but it unraveled something in me. A simple reminder, you are not alone. I swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in my eyes, and for the first time, I let myself lean into him. Just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be held without conditions. Noah exhaled softly, his fingers tightening on my arm. "It's time," he murmured. And this time I nodded, because he was right. It was time. I turned back toward the apartment, my gaze sweeping over everything that had once made up my life here. The framed photos on the walls, the books stacked on the coffee table, the sweater Nathan had tossed over the arm of the couch the night before, as if he would always return to claim it. But he wouldn't. Not this time. The decision had been made in pieces, long before tonight, long before this fight. It had been forming in the moments when I found myself staring at my own reflection, wondering when my voice had become so small. In the mornings when I woke to the weight of a love that felt more like an obligation than a choice. In the nights I had spent curled up on my side of the bed, cold and waiting. There was nothing left to salvage. Packing took almost no effort. It startled me how little I wanted to bring with me. A suitcase, half full with clothes that still felt like mine. My notebooks, filled with words I had never shared. A single photograph, one of myself, long before Nathan, long before I had learned to shrink myself into the shape of someone he could tolerate. Noah stood in the doorway as I moved, silent but present. The steadiness of him was the only thing keeping my hands from trembling. He had always been like that, like the lighthouse standing firm while the waves crashed mercilessly against the shore. When I finally zipped the suitcase shut, he stepped forward, his fingers brushing against mine as he took the handle from me. "Are you ready?" His voice was low, careful. I swallowed. Was I? There was no dramatic final glance over my shoulder, no rush of regret or second-guessing. Just the simple understanding that I could not stay here and still be myself. "Yes," I whispered. And for the first time, I meant it. Noah's hand found the small of my back as we stepped outside, his touch light but grounding. A quiet promise, you don't have to do this alone. I let the door close behind me, and I did not look back. The night air felt different as I stepped outside, lighter, cooler, as if the weight pressing against my ribs had finally begun to lift. The city stretched before me, its glow indifferent to my departure. Behind me, the apartment stood dark and silent, no longer mine. Noah moved beside me without a word, his presence steady as he took my suitcase and placed it into the trunk. The street was quiet except for the soft hum of a distant car, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Sliding into the passenger seat, I closed the door and stared straight ahead. I didn't look back. As Noah started the engine, the soft glow of the dashboard painted his face in flickering light. His expression was unreadable, but I knew him well enough to recognize the way his fingers flexed against the steering wheel. Measured, careful. The only sign of the emotions he wasn't saying aloud. The streets blurred past us, familiar roads fading into something distant. Each turn took me further from the life I had spent too long trying to fix, from the version of myself I had let slip away. Noah didn't ask if I was okay. He knew better. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my hand where it rested in my lap. The touch was brief, feather-light, but it was enough. A silent reminder, I've got you. I turned toward him, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, relief, maybe something deeper, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Before I could second-guess it, I leaned in, closing the space between us. Noah's breath caught, his hand tightening around mine, but he didn't pull away. My lips pressed against his cheek, just near the edge of his mouth, lingering for a second longer than necessary. Warmth spread between us, quiet and unspoken. When I pulled back, his eyes flickered toward me, surprised, searching. But he didn't speak. He just turned his palm upward, waiting. I laced my fingers through his, holding on. And together we drove into the night. The hum of the car filled the silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt steady, like the rhythm of something inevitable. I kept my fingers laced with Noah's, my thumb brushing lightly over his skin, grounding myself in the warmth of his presence. The airport came into view, its fluorescent lights cutting through the night, sterile and impersonal. My chest tightened. This was it, the point of no return. Noah pulled up to the curb and shifted into park, but he didn't let go of my hand. I turned to him, searching his face, but he was unreadable again, his expression carefully guarded. He had always been like that, strong, dependable, the kind of person who held everything together, even when it felt like things were falling apart. "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet, hesitant. Not because he doubted my decision, but because he knew how much I had doubted myself before. I swallowed, glancing toward the terminal doors, the glass reflecting a distorted version of myself back at me. But for once, I didn't see someone who was running away. I saw someone finally choosing herself. "Yes," I whispered. And I meant it. Noah exhaled slowly, nodding, but his grip on my hand didn't loosen. Instead, he lifted it, his thumb tracing over my knuckles in a slow, deliberate motion. Then, without warning, he leaned in. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. His lips brushed against my forehead first, lingering there, warm and sure, before he tilted his head slightly, his mouth grazing the very corner of mine. A kiss, not quite on my lips, but close enough that my breath hitched, my pulse stumbling in my throat. My eyes fluttered shut for just a second, absorbing the quiet intensity of it. When he pulled back, his hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb brushing along my cheek in a way that felt more like a promise than a goodbye. And then, before I could overthink it, before I could let doubt creep back in, I stepped out of the car and walked through the doors without looking back. The airport was a blur, flashes of bright screens, the murmur of voices, the distant echo of announcements I barely heard. I moved on autopilot, checking in, handing over my passport, making my way through security. It wasn't until I was settled into my seat, the plane taxiing down the runway, that I let myself breathe. I had done it. I was leaving. The flight passed in a blur, a quiet hum of turbulence and whispered thoughts. I barely remembered takeoff. Only the warmth of Noah's hand resting between us on the armrest, his fingers barely brushing mine. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. I kept my eyes on the window as the clouds parted, revealing the coastline below, rugged cliffs meeting an endless stretch of blue, the golden light of the setting sun washing over the land like something out of a dream. Noah had chosen this place for me. For us. The realization settled deep in my chest, somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. When the wheels touched down, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We had made it. Noah reached for my hand again as we stepped off the plane, his grip firmer this time, less hesitant. The airport air was thick with the scent of salt and something warm, earthy, rich, like sun-baked stone. Everything felt different here. Lighter. Free. A driver was already waiting for us, holding a small sign with Noah's last name on it. Of course, he had arranged everything. He always did. The drive through the countryside was quiet, the car weaving through narrow roads flanked by rolling vineyards and whitewashed houses with red-tiled roofs. The kind of place I had once dreamed of visiting, before I had forgotten how to dream at all. I turned to Noah, my pulse slow and steady for the first time in what felt like years. "Why Portugal?" I asked softly. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. "Because you told me once," he murmured, "that this was the place you wanted to go when you finally decided to live for yourself." My chest tightened, a lump forming in my throat. I had told him that. Not recently. Not in the midst of everything falling apart. It had been years ago, before Nathan, before the weight of someone else's expectations had shaped my life into something unrecognizable. And yet, Noah had remembered. The villa was perched on the edge of a hillside, its warm yellow walls glowing softly against the darkening sky. Worn wooden shutters framed the windows, and beyond them, the sea stretched wide and endless, meeting the horizon in a quiet embrace. I stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply. The air tasted different here. Noah came up behind me, resting a hand against my lower back, a touch so instinctive, so familiar, that I leaned into it without thinking. "Come inside," he said softly. "There's something waiting for you." I followed him through the arched doorway, my footsteps echoing against the cool terracotta floors. The space was simple. Open windows letting in the night breeze, a rustic wooden table in the center of the room, a flickering candle casting soft shadows against the walls. And on the bed, a package wrapped in deep blue fabric. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the delicate knot before slowly untying it. Inside was a swimsuit, the color of the ocean, cut in a way that left no room for hesitation, no space for the self-doubt I had carried for too long. I swallowed, running my fingers over the fabric. "You always said you wanted to swim in the Atlantic," Noah murmured behind me. "Not just look at it. Not just dip your feet in. You wanted to be in it." My breath shuddered. I had said that too. And now, for the first time, there was nothing stopping me. The fabric of the swimsuit was soft beneath my fingertips, a quiet reminder of the version of myself I had nearly lost. The woman who had once dreamed, who had once longed to live untethered, unafraid. Noah had remembered her, even when I had forgotten. Emotions swelled in my chest, thick and aching, something too vast to be contained in words. I turned slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the swimsuit against me. Noah stood a few steps away, watching me with that same quiet intensity he always had, steady, patient, waiting for me to catch up to the truth he had known all along. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just closed the distance between us, rising onto my toes as my hands found the back of his neck, fingers threading into his hair. And then I kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a whisper of warmth against his lips. A kiss that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of something unspoken but undeniable. Noah stilled for just a second, just long enough for me to wonder if I had crossed some invisible line. But then his hands found my waist, grounding me, pulling me closer. He kissed me back, slow and sure, like he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Joy bubbled up inside me, surprising and light, spilling into the kiss as I smiled against his lips. When I finally pulled away, breathless, I let my forehead rest against his. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling with everything I couldn't put into words. His fingers skimmed over my back, lingering at the small of it, his touch as steady as ever. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured, his breath warm against my cheek. "Just be happy." A soft laugh escaped me, light and unburdened. For the first time in years, I believed I could be. And with Noah beside me, I knew I wouldn't have to do it alone. The waves whispered to me as they curled onto the shore, their rhythm steady, patient waiting. The vastness of the Atlantic stretched before me, endless and untamed, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid of it. The air was thick with salt and warmth, the sky painted in shades of gold and lavender as the last light of day dipped below the horizon. Behind me, the villa stood quiet and welcoming, its open windows carrying the scent of citrus and earth. And Noah was there, watching, always watching, his presence steady even when I couldn't see him. I glanced down at myself, at the deep blue swimsuit that fit like it had always belonged to me. I had spent years hesitating, shrinking, folding myself into someone else's mold. But not now. Not here. The first step into the water sent a shock through me, cold and sharp against my skin. I gasped, laughing softly at the sensation. The next step was easier, then another, until the waves licked at my thighs, wrapping around me in an embrace that felt almost familiar. The ocean didn't care about the woman I had been before. It only knew me as I was now, bare, open, finally choosing to step forward instead of waiting. I waded deeper, letting the water pull me into its arms. And then, without thinking, without fearing, I let go. The waves lifted me, carrying me effortlessly as I floated, weightless, my body moving with the tide instead of against it. The sky stretched above me, vast and endless, and something inside me cracked open, something I had kept locked away for too long. A laugh bubbled up from my chest, spilling into the air. Not the hollow, careful laughter I had learned to perfect, but something real, something full. I heard the splash before I saw him. Noah. He had followed me in, his movements slower, deliberate. His dark hair clung to his forehead, droplets sliding down his face as he waded toward me. "Didn't think you'd do it alone, did you?" His voice was low, teasing, but there was something else beneath it. Something softer. I smiled, salt water clinging to my lips. "I would've," I admitted. "But I'm glad you're here." He reached for me then, his hand skimming over my waist as he pulled me closer, the ocean rocking us gently. My heart stuttered, not with fear, but with something new, something I wasn't afraid to name anymore. I reached up, cupping his jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers. And before hesitation could creep in, I kissed him again. This time, it wasn't just gratitude. This time, it was a beginning. Noah kissed me back, deep and slow, his arms tightening around me as the waves carried us. The world blurred, the water cradling us like it had been waiting for this moment as long as we had. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and grinning, he pressed his forehead to mine. "You're free now," he murmured. I nodded, closing my eyes, letting the ocean rock me, letting Noah hold me, letting myself believe it. "I know," I whispered, and for the first time in years I truly did. The water clung to my skin as we made our way back to shore, our breaths still uneven from laughter, from the weight of everything we had left behind. The night had fully settled over Portugal now, the sky draped in deep indigo, stars blinking awake above the quiet waves. Noah walked beside me, his arm brushing against mine as we stepped onto the cool, damp sand. I felt lighter than I had in years, like the ocean had stripped away every hesitation, every lingering doubt, and left me with only what mattered. Him. Me. This moment. I reached for his hand without thinking, threading my fingers through his as we made our way back to the villa. He squeezed gently, a quiet acknowledgement, a promise. The villa was warm when we stepped inside, the scent of salt water and night air following us through the open windows. A single lamp cast a soft glow over the room, golden light flickering against the walls. It felt safe. It felt like home. Noah disappeared for a moment, returning with a towel and a glass of wine. I let out a small, breathless laugh as he wrapped the towel around my shoulders, rubbing my arms gently to warm me. His touch was steady, absent of hesitation, like he had always known exactly how to take care of me. I tipped my head back, looking up at him. You thought of everything, didn't you? His lips curved, but there was something deeper in his gaze, something unreadable. I just wanted to make sure you had what you deserved. The words settled between us, soft and heavy. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached up, brushing damp strands of hair away from his forehead before leaning in slow, certain. The kiss was different this time. No urgency, no lingering fear. Just warmth. Just the quiet, steady understanding that we were here, together, that we had made it to the other side of something that once felt impossible. When we pulled apart, Noah exhaled, resting his forehead against mine. You're happy, he murmured, almost as if he hadn't believed it could happen until now. I smiled, brushing my fingers against his jaw. I am, and for the first time in my life it was true.